Lehman Brothers 2008 shock, when the capital markets almost froze up, the narrative, I've learned all these new words to describe political process. I mean, anyway, the narrative was we had a heart attack, we didn't die, we'll now have an ordinary recovery. And some people stuck up their hands and said, no, we won't. There's a balance sheet recession. There's lingering damage. Somewhere along the line, you know, a bunch of us started to insert the sort of structural distortions that we had caused before that were part of the process of getting to the crisis. And now, with the most clear pattern of divergence between employment and growth recovery that we've ever had in the post-war period, I think there's wide recognition that the employment, and this is a graph that Roberto Zaga is here. He was the secretary to the Growth Commission, so he's entirely responsible for the errors that we made. This was done, I think, by political scientists. What this is a picture of the United States Gini coefficient in blue and a reasonably sensible measure of political polarization in the House of Representatives in the United States. Now, I have no idea what to tell you about this, but I think it's scary. And what I mean is I don't know what to tell you about it in causal terms, but it's still scary. And it's not what you'd like to see, either on the income distribution side or the political functionality side. And I can't believe that they're entirely unrelated to each other. This is a picture. Again, if I've given you a little model in your mind, in the back of your head, then these things should fit together. So this is a picture of, this is very hard data to get right, but this is a picture of the fraction of national income on average in OECD countries going to labor. That is earned income. So where else does it go? It goes to the owners of capital, or the government takes some of it and spends it on our behalf. And the government hasn't been taking more of it. So this is, what you see in this is that for a good chunk of the post-war period up to the mid to late 70s, labor share of income rose. And then it turned around quite dramatically and started to decline, and is still in decline. This is roughly coincident with when the patterns of rising inequality and some of these other structural dynamics that I've been trying to describe to you started to occur. This I won't do, but I'll leave this behind. I am just stunned at how big the differences are in measured income inequality across countries. And I'm not going to belabor this, but pick any measure of income inequality, and the difference between the United States and Germany is huge, just huge. And I think this raises questions about whether what you see in the pre-tax income distribution is really a market outcome, or rather maybe a market outcome overlaid with some social values that differ across countries. I would put that in the to be done category of research. The last thing I'll tell you about is China, and I will shut up. China, I think you know, is an economy that was running on a growth model that had exports and extraordinarily high levels of investment. What you see here are the investment levels. This has never been done before. And they are, or were, until recently, in the process of pushing this model past the end of its useful life, which means when in doubt in China, invest. If there's a shortfall in demand anywhere, exports fall off, the world had a crisis, invest. Okay? If you keep doing that, then you do the opposite of what you saw in many of the advanced countries, which is you distort the economy toward investment as part of the composition of demand, and with some other policies you may distort it toward the tradable side as well. And the China, I'm not going to go over it because it's so complicated, but the Chinese reform process fundamentally on the supply and the demand side is to change this growth model in composition. So on the supply side, it's a whole lot of more market and more structural flexibility and rising value added per person, and a much bigger role for the, thus far, almost suppressed. I'm using these qualifiers because if China makes this change, they're going to, and are successful, then they're actually going to change the growth model and remove the defects that are there if they stay on the old growth model. I mean, it's a simple sort of version of that. But the thing I wanted to leave you with is this, just to kind of try to cement the conclusion. If the Chinese or anybody else tries to think about the evolution of the growth pattern in China without thinking about the demand side, you'll fail. You can't do it. All right? It's both the demand and supply sides that are the keys to understanding this. And the one that tends to get ignored because it's not in the models, although I have to say I don't think the Chinese policymakers are doing this, is the demand side. So here's a picture of, over time, not completely up to date, but they haven't reversed this trend, of household disposable income as a fraction of national income. So it's been trending down steadily for well over a decade. It's under 60% now. The household savings rate in China is about 18%. It's about a third of all the savings that, finance this 45% of GDP investment. But it's about 30%. So if you just combine the trend in income with the savings rate, you end up with consumption, by most people's estimates, under 40%. Now, if you know sort of the data that describe the configuration of economies, and when you went around the world, you would look long and hard to find an economy that was running effectively on consumption, household consumption of 40%. The more normal numbers are like 65 or 70 or something like that. And this isn't going to work in the long run. So the big challenge, actually, so if you back up from this and ask, what is this? This is an economy that started with a state that decided to be a market economy that owned all the assets. And the state still owns a huge amount of assets, controls the income that goes with it, and owns the enterprises that constitute half of the so-called private sector, and controls the income that comes from that. The households don't control enough income to support the evolving growth model that they want. And so over time, and with some tailwinds coming from rapidly rising wages, many of you know W. Arthur Lewis, and the Lewis effect, which is the surplus labor holds down the rate of wage increase, and so for a period of time, the fraction of income going to capital or government tends to rise. And he worried about that from a distributional point of view, but at some point that pattern, that characterized China clearly. And somewhere in the last 2 years, roughly, that pattern broke. And so you're now seeing wage increases in the Pearl River Delta of 15 or 20% a year. That is a headache for the entrepreneurs there because they got to hunt around and find another place to go. It's compressing their margins mightily, but it's exactly what should happen, right? Because this will drive up household income, and then the households, will be middle-class consumers, and the urbanization process will be more effective, and the whole non-tradable service sector will start to grow and generate employment for the remainder of the people. So that's the Chinese growth model. The underlying structural characteristics are the same. It's a developing country, but the underlying principles are the same. Where they are on the spectrum is completely different than what I described to you before. It's almost the mirror image. But I think if you put those two things together, then you'll maybe at least give me the benefit of the doubt and acknowledge that part of effective sustainable growth, and by sustainable I mean, decades, a decade or so, where the growth pattern probably have to change, involves being serious about the level and composition of aggregate demand, particularly on the domestic side, and that can get out of whack. It can get out of whack because you're underinvesting. It can get out of whack because the level's too high in the domestic, part starts to dominate, crowding out the, etc. And in the Chinese case, it can get out of whack by pushing the investment into low return territory. Why is that a bad idea? I mean, the Solo Swan said, capital deepening will stop because an economy that's well managed, meaning a market economy, will stop, and a good government will stop investing when the returns get low. Why? For the obvious reason, the citizens wouldn't vote for it, and the markets won't do it once the return gets below the discount rate. The Chinese economy, as currently configured, is quite capable of pushing investment well past any reasonable estimate of what the social or private discount rate might be. And that is a trap. And it's a trap because it generates aggregate demand right now. And so you think, gee, this is working. But the reason an investment-led growth model works with high returns is that the base, the denominator, gets bigger. That is the return, right? And so you can keep doing it. If the returns are really low, the base doesn't get bigger. I call them intertemporal multipliers. The intertemporal multipliers don't exist. And so you have to keep upping the ante to generate that aggregate demand, and eventually you can't do it anymore. Now, they've figured this out, but it took a little while because there aren't many examples of excess investment growth patterns in the world economy. I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about. If I've given you Excedrin Hedrick number 5, I apologize. But I'm hoping over time that we learn more from each other's growth experiences by diagnosing them, advanced and developing countries. I learned most of what I learned initially from developing countries and from the people on the Growth Commission who knew a lot more than I did. But I think we can get better at this over time, but it's going to take a more elaborate conceptual structure than we currently have. It's going to take more structure than is embedded in macroeconomic models. You cannot read this in to simple macro models. I'm not attacking macroeconomics. I'm just saying we have to build it out a bit. And then I think, we can do this. But it's going to take time. And probably a lot of economists who are younger than I am. Thank you very much.
Well, friends, as you can see, a lot of thought, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of evidence. I now open the floor for discussion. Yes, please. Would you introduce yourself?
My name is Mohit Satyanan. You talked about the tradable and the non-tradable sector. The other significant feature of the US is the existence of large multinational corporations.
Right.
And the repatriation of dividends, which I know is a contentious political issue.
Right.
But where would you fit the revenues from those into the tradable and the non-tradable side? And what's the impact of that feeding into the domestic economy?
Mike, if I may,
Yeah,
shall I collect about 5 questions,
okay.
and then I think that's
More
a
efficient.
good idea.
Okay.
Yes, please.
My name is Satpal. I'm retired Commodore of the Indian Navy. I mentioned my rank, Brigadier General, just to convey to you that my knowledge of economy is -0. So my question is a layman's question. My question is it possible to shift this paradigm of dispersal of funds to avoid confrontation between urbanization and environment, which the chairperson mentioned? I will explain. Presently, funds are dispersed. I'm a little scared because Mr. Mantek Singh already is sitting here. Presently, funds are dispersed on per capita basis. If Delhi has a population of 15 million, they get 15 times the funds of some other town which has 1 million. My opinion is, or my proposal is, that if 10 people are staying in 1 acre of land and 1 person is staying in 10 acre of land, both of them should get equal funds. So we should call them funds per capita hectare. The 10 people staying in 1 acre should get same money than 1 person staying in 1 acre. So 10 people will now try to shift that side rather than 500,000 coming to Delhi.
Thank you. We have Pierre. On this side,
Thank you. Pierre Jacquet from the Global Development Network. I wanted to question you again on the separation between tradable and non-tradable. First of all, you argue that there is a positive externality from tradable to non-tradable, but the reverse exists as well. You have expenses on education, infrastructure that can also be of service to the tradable sector. Second, when you try to get out of the crisis through the tradable sector, that assumes that you have external demand to do that, and if the aggregate shock affects a great number of countries, you may not have that external demand. And if everyone tries to get out through the tradable sector expansion, then you have a problem. I guess another way to ask the question is to argue whether you told us about growth theory or about growth distribution between countries. If you take the world as a closed system, the separation between tradable and non-tradable doesn't hold any longer. So what are the sources of growth at the aggregate level?
yes, the two hands here and then one here. Go ahead.
I have a very specific question to ask.
You have to introduce yourself.
My name is Ashish Gupta. Is it possible that the market might call the bluff of the European Central Bank and the US Central Bank?
Say it again.
Is it possible that the market might call I'm asking you, is it possible that the markets, the financial markets, might call the bluff of the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve? I'll just explain in 30 seconds. You said that Europe is holding up because the ECB made this promise in July 2012 that they're behind the bond markets of the southern European countries. And you said that the Fed is basically likely to reduce the QE that's going on just now. But what I've understood is that jobs are unlikely to grow that fast. And QE tapering has been linked to unemployment coming down to 6.5% or something. Right. So is it possible that the bond yields in these two areas could shoot up in the near term? That's the question.
The next person, yes.
My name is Sudhir Deva. I'm an independent consultant. My query, Dr. Spence, you were comparing Germany and US. I would like to know how do you place, say, Africa and Southeast Asia in the growth path across the decade?
Please.
I'm Sumesh, journalist from Business Analyst Newspaper.
Could you give him another mic? That thing is a piece of...
Somesh, journalist from Business Analyst Newspaper. I will talk about the Indian economy. We are in a situation where we face low demand along with high inflation, but there's also low growth along with high deficit. So how do you suggest that we should get out of this deadlock? I mean, so that would be my question to you.
Well, I think we could now let Mike speak.
Right. Okay. Just let me write this. I'll try to be very brief. Multinationals, as best I can tell, are largely on the tradable side, and they are, for the most part, the architects of these global supply chains. That is, they move the stuff around. When it makes sense, they're getting better and better at it. But for the most part, they're the architects of global supply chains, and the global supply chains, bits and pieces, tend to be in the tradable side. By bits and pieces, I mean these components that get placed in various places. You know, multinationals don't always behave the same way. You know, they always had, you know, the ones based in a particular place have dual citizenship. You know, they have some degree of responsibility and loyalty to the place where they come from, and some degree of responsibility to all the markets and economies that they operate in, and that's a tension, I guess I would say. And they resolve it in different ways. But on balance, I think probably reasonably. Urbanization in the environment. I think that your proposal at the end won't work. That is, urbanization is a complex and to some extent inevitably chaotic process. But I think the key components are understood. You know, Dr. Ahluwalia is working hard on this in the Indian context, as are, I think, a number of her colleagues. You need in my judgment, to have a strong municipal government that has financial resources and takes responsibility. I mean, it takes a while to get there. In the early stages of growth, you know, you don't have municipal bond markets, you don't have a property tax that generates revenue. You're living with a model where you're selling land, and that's obviously not sustainable. Once you have that situation, that may take a fiscal reconfiguration in terms of the federal structure in many countries, but anyway, it's important. Et cetera, goes on from there. I think functioning markets, especially in land, that are level playing fields are an important part of this process. I don't know what to say about, subsidies from the government and whether it should be based on how many square feet you have or whatnot, but I don't think it's a central question. I think it's and finally, I would say urbanization is not, and I want to underline this, an environmental catastrophe if managed properly. Now, I think most of it would have to admit, as a process, most of the time, the environmental issues fall behind the urbanization process, if I can put it that way. That's just an empirical statement. But in fact, urban environments properly built are in many, many ways an environmental plus. They can be very energy efficient. If the buildings are vertical, the transportation system works, the buildings are energy efficient, and so on. So I think it's a big, big job to get there, but I think it can be done. I didn't talk about this aggregate demand adding up problem. Can everybody grow? So let me give the following answer. The answer is yes, because if you generate the real growth, but you can, just as I said, an economy can get out of balance. The global economy can't get out of balance in sort of tradable, non-tradable dimensions, because that's a silly idea. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But it can get out of balance in terms of aggregate demand and supply. So if I'd had more time, we spent a lot of time sort of scratching our heads before the crisis hit about the question of global imbalances, because people thought they looked peculiar and they wouldn't last. And if they unwind in an uncoordinated way, then you can leave yourself short of aggregate demand, or you could actually get the reverse, although that's not what people predicted. And we may be short of aggregate demand in the global economy, but it's not as bad as it might have been, because the major imbalances are unwinding in a reasonably coordinated way. And the two biggest used to be China and the United States, and they're coming down at similar rates. So the Chinese current account surplus is approaching 2%. And the American one isn't quite that far down on the other side. So on the whole, I guess without being able to prove it to you with data, I would say we're probably not in a aggregate demand short zero-sum environment on the tradable side, or at least not badly so. Can anybody call the bluff of the ECB? Well, if you have enough money. But I got to tell you, with German backing and a commitment to make unlimited purchases of sovereign debt, it would take a fair amount of courage. And I don't think George Soros would do it. And he went after the Bank of England, but on a different dimension, right? I mean, the Bank of England was holding up their currency. If you do that, you can run out of reserves. So Soros said, I don't think I can pull that one off. And he did. But the thing that would undo this is if Germany pulled the bank. As many of you know this, but the ECB with German backing, and by German backing I mean Chancellor Merkel told Mario Draghi, I will support you in making unlimited conditional purchases of sovereign debt to stabilize these markets, and I don't care if my own central banker voted against you, and he did. And they created what is called the OMT, which means outright monetary transactions, and it has never been used, not once. And the reason is just sitting there stabilized the spreads and the yields. Is it possible that would break down? Yes. I mean, there are a variety of ways it could. If the government in the country where I live most of the time continues to exhibit behavior that is somewhere in the range between irresponsible and oblivious, then I can imagine the Germans, citizens, would eventually say to Chancellor Merkel, we're not building a bridge to anything. Yeah, they're doing something else. We don't know what it is. And then it would be a political process, but the Chancellor couldn't sustain this support. If Germany pulls the rug on the OMT or things like it, there was a similar intervention in the banking system, then this could unravel very quickly. And you could say goodbye to the Eurozone if that starts to happen, because you cannot get out of this with 7 and 8% yields on sovereign debt if you're Italy and Spain. It's just not possible. So that residual systemic risk is there, and it very much depends on cooperative, responsible, asymmetric behavior on the part of Germany and the Troika, including the IMF on the one hand, and the governments, the behavior of governments that are in trouble. That's kind of where we are. But right now, the systemic risk is gone, largely from the markets. That doesn't mean, the big bond funds are piling in yet, but partly because the yields aren't that high anymore. But that's where we are. Africa and Southeast Asia. And can I add South Asia? I'm really optimistic. People thought that the tapering announcement was going to destabilize a lot of economies, and I know it created a whole lot of headaches for central banks and policymakers, so I don't mean to dismiss it, but I never thought that that would ultimately be destabilizing, and I think it's right. And if you look at the growth patterns, there's clearly a lull. Capital market distortions and some deglobalization that was required as a defense measure, and low growth in these economies that are more than 50% of the tradable part, the demand side, hasn't helped. I think the China growth, if it comes to pass, will help. It'll be a real tailwind. But Africa's growing nicely. I expect India and Brazil to return to relatively high growth. I mean, 5% isn't bad anyway. I know it's disappointing, but there's a lot of folks around the world to be thrilled to have 5% growth. So, and the problems are manageable. I mean, I use the framework when I'm looking at these things that's going to sound funny to you, but when there's a real challenge, I ask, are the resources there to deal with it? Are the people who are going to make the decisions highly competent? And is there the political will to deal with it? I think it's actually quite a useful framework. So I looked at Greece and said, they don't have the resources without help. This will implode. I didn't even get to competence. There are many contrarians on China. I think they're nuts. They have resources beyond belief in the state balance sheet. Anybody who knows them knows they're competent in the same way your technocrats are, and highly competent. And is there political will? Well, I mean, you can imagine there's political will issues with respect to overriding the huge vested interest in the state-owned enterprises. But with respect to short-run stabilization or dealing with non-performing loans or a housing bubble, I mean, there just isn't going to be, so it just passes all the tests. And I think that's true to the credit of the developing countries on a huge, broad front. The bitter lessons that were learned from the past, especially the 97, 98 episode, have positioned developing countries in a position of strength, absolutely and relative to the past. And there's lots of obstacles and political fights to get through, and leadership to be exercised and so on. But I don't see anything that's going to disrupt the convergence process. And if I can add, I apologize, this is a bit long, and there's a clear pattern of resilience that wasn't, and non-dependence. it's sometimes called partial decoupling in the developing world. It's a source of, I think, great reassurance. So in some sense, within a range, it doesn't matter how much we muck up stuff in the advanced countries, provided we just don't produce an implosion. I think we're okay. And finally, low growth, high inflation. Well, you know, it's a hard problem, but I don't think in the end the growth is tied to, I mean, you get growth slowdowns.